Alpha King called her weak. Then she saved his life. In the northern reaches of the kingdom of Thornwall, where the mountains clawed at gray skies and the forests grew so dense that sunlight had to fight for every inch of ground, there lived a young Omega named Leora Voss. She was not the sort of Omega the kingdom celebrated. She was not draped in silk. She did not live behind high walls with servants to brush her hair or lords competing for her hand. Leora lived in a crooked stone cottage at the edge of the village of Brackenmoor, where the air always smelled of pine resin and wet earth, and where the wolves howled at night so close that their voices rattled the shutters. She was beautiful. There was no denying it, even by those who wished to deny everything about her. Her hair was the color of dark honey, falling in loose waves past her shoulders. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, bright as the moss that clung to the riverbanks. Her skin was pale, unmarked, and when she moved through the village marketplace each morning, more than one alpha turned to watch her pass. But Leora carried herself with something that made the villagers uneasy. She walked with her chin up. She spoke clearly, without the soft, deferential murmur expected of an Omega. She asked questions, she argued, and worst of all, she healed. Old Marin, the village herb woman, had taken Leora in when she was just 9 years old, after fever claimed both of Leora's parents in a single terrible winter. Marin had no children of her own, and no patience for the kingdom's rigid ideas about what an Omega should and should not learn. She taught Leora the names and uses of every root, leaf, bark, and mushroom within 100 miles. She taught her to read a pulse, to smell infection beneath a wound's surface, to brew tinctures that could ease pain or slow a racing heart. By the time Leora was 22, she could do things that most trained physicians in the capital could not, and she had never set foot outside of Brackenmoor. The kingdom of Thornwall was ruled by the Ashvane dynasty, a bloodline of alphas so powerful that their wolves were said to be twice the size of ordinary shifters. For 300 years, an Ashvane had sat upon the ironwood throne, and for 300 years, Omegas had occupied a carefully defined position in Thornwall's society, treasured, protected, and utterly without power. Omegas could not own land. They could not hold titles. They could not practice medicine, sit on councils, or speak before the court without an alpha's permission. The laws were old, carved into the kingdom's founding charter, and most citizens, alphas and Omegas alike, had long since stopped questioning them. The current king was Draven Ashvane, 28 years old and already a legend. He had taken the throne at 21 after his father, King Harlan, died in a border skirmish with the Kelmorian raiders to the east. Draven had ended that war in 6 months, not through negotiation, but through a campaign so relentless and so brutal that the Kelmorians had sued for peace and never crossed the border again. He was tall, powerfully built, with black hair that he wore pushed back from a face that might have been carved from stone, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes so dark they appeared almost black until the light caught them and revealed their true color, a deep, burning amber. When Draven shifted into his wolf form, he became a massive beast of midnight black fur, taller at the shoulder than a warhorse, with those same amber eyes blazing like twin flames in the dark. He was admired, he was feared, and he was, by every account, utterly convinced that Omegas were the weakest link in the kingdom's chain. Not cruelly, Draven was not a tyrant. He funded Omega shelters, ensured they were fed and housed, and punished any alpha caught abusing an Omega with swift severity. But he viewed Omegas the way a shepherd views lambs, with a protective instinct rooted in the absolute certainty that they could never protect themselves. He had said so publicly, more than once. In his coronation address, he had declared that the strength of Thornwall depended on its alphas, and that the sacred duty of every alpha was to shield the kingdom's Omegas from a world they were not built to face. The crowd had cheered, the Omegas in attendance had lowered their eyes, and the laws remained unchanged. The trouble began in the autumn of Draven's 7th year as king, though no one recognized it as trouble at first. It started with a cough, a persistent, dry cough that Draven could not shake, no matter how much honeyed tea the royal physician, Lord Gadamer, pressed upon him. Then came the fatigue, a heaviness in his limbs that made his morning sparring sessions shorter, his council meetings more irritable, his appetite thinner. Lord Gadamer, a stout beta with 30 years of service to the crown, assured the king that it was nothing more than the change of season. The mountain air turned bitter in autumn, and even an alpha's constitution could be tested. But Draven's beta captain, a sharp-eyed man named Corwin Braith, was not so easily reassured. He had served Draven since they were boys, and he knew the king's body and habits better than anyone. He saw how Draven's hands sometimes trembled when he gripped the arms of the throne. He noticed the faint gray tinge beneath the king's bronze skin. He watched the way Draven would pause mid-sentence as if searching for a word that had suddenly vanished from his mind, and then cover the lapse with a wave of his hand or a growl of impatience. Corwin said nothing to the king. Draven would have dismissed his concerns with that iron stubbornness that was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous flaw. Instead, Corwin began watching and worrying. It was around this same time that the Margrave Soren Halt proposed a new initiative to the king's council. Soren was Draven's chief political advisor, a tall, lean alpha with silver-streaked auburn hair and a smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes. He came from one of Thornwall's oldest noble families, and he had served as Margrave, the highest advisory rank below the crown, for nearly 4 years. He was brilliant, eloquent, and universally respected. His proposal was simple: a seasonal gathering of Omegas from every province, brought to the capital city of Ashenmere for what he called the Concord of Service. Each Omega would be assessed for useful domestic skills, weaving, cooking, tending, cleaning, and assigned to noble households or crown facilities where their talents could best serve the kingdom. It was, Soren argued, a way to honor the Omega's place in society while ensuring that none went without shelter or purpose. The council approved it unanimously. Draven signed the decree without hesitation, and throughout the kingdom, Omega names were added to lists, and carriages were sent to collect them. Leora's name was on the Brackenmore list. She learned of it on a cold morning in late autumn, when the village elder, a nervous beta named Haddon, appeared at her cottage door with a rolled parchment bearing the royal seal. She was to report to the capital within a fortnight. She was to bring nothing but personal clothing and any proof of skills she might possess. She was to present herself for assessment at the Hall of the Concord, where the Margrave himself would oversee the proceedings. Leora read the parchment twice, folded it carefully, and set it on the table beside a jar of dried lavender. Then she sat down and thought for a very long time. Old Marin had died 2 winters past, leaving Leora alone in the cottage with nothing but her herbs, her books, and a reputation that made the village both dependent on her and uncomfortable with her existence. She had healed Brackenmoor's sick for years. She had set bones, delivered babies, cured fevers, and once, memorably, saved the life of the village blacksmith after a piece of hot iron lodged itself in his thigh and the wound turned septic. No physician had been available. No alpha had stepped forward to help. Leora had cut, cleaned, stitched, and dosed the man through 3 nights of delirium until his fever broke and his color returned. The blacksmith was alive because of her. But when Haddon had filled out the skills assessment for each Omega in Brackenmore, he had listed Leora's abilities as herbalism, minor, and domestic tending, because healing was not something an Omega was supposed to do. The journey to Ashenmere took 5 days by carriage, along roads that wound through valleys carpeted in fallen leaves, the color of rust and gold. Leora traveled with 3 other Omegas from neighboring villages: a shy girl named Pella, who wept the entire first day, a quiet older woman named Dorsen, who knitted without pause and spoke only to correct Pella's posture, and a boy of barely 17 named Ivor, who stared out the window with the hollow expression of someone who had already decided that nothing good awaited them. Leora tried to comfort Pella, exchanged a few words with Dorsen about the quality of the wool she was using, and left Ivor to his silence. She spent most of the journey watching the landscape change from the wild, tangled green of the northern provinces to the ordered farmlands and eventually the sprawling stone walls of the capital. Ashenmere was enormous. Leora had read about it in Marin's books, but reading about a city and standing before its gates were 2 entirely different experiences. The walls rose 60 feet high, built from dark granite quarried from the very mountains that cradled the city on 3 sides. Towers studded the walls at regular intervals, each flying the Ashvane banner, a black wolf on a field of deep crimson. Beyond the gates, the city unfolded in layers: the lower districts of merchants and craftsmen, the middle tier of guild halls and barracks, and at the summit, the palace of Thornwall itself, a fortress of black stone and iron that seemed to grow from the mountain rather than merely sit upon it. The Hall of the Concord was a repurposed military barracks near the palace grounds, hastily decorated with banners and fresh rushes to give the impression of ceremony. When Leora arrived, there were already hundreds of Omegas gathered inside, women and men of every age, from every corner of the kingdom, all wearing the same expression of uncertain compliance. Officials in Margrave Halt's colors moved among them with ledgers and quills, recording names, ages, provinces of origin, and listed skills. The air smelled of too many bodies and not enough ventilation, underlaid with the sharp bite of cheap incense meant to mask it. Leora gave her name to a clerk and waited. Hours passed. Omegas were called forward in groups, paraded before a panel of assessors who examined their hands for calluses, their teeth for health, their posture for obedience. It reminded Leora of the livestock auctions she had seen as a child, and the comparison sat in her stomach like a stone. When her group was finally called, she stood before the panel with her back straight and her eyes level, which immediately earned her a frown from the lead assessor, a pinch-faced beta woman named Vielle. "Skills?" Vielle asked without looking up from her ledger. "Healing," Leora said. "Herbal medicine, wound treatment, diagnosis of illness, preparation of tinctures and—" "Herbalism," Vielle interrupted, scratching something in the ledger. "Domestic. Noted. Next." "I said healing," Leora repeated, her voice carrying further than she intended. Several Omegas nearby turned to look. "I have trained for 13 years under a master herbalist. I can identify over 300 medicinal plants, treat infections, set fractures, and—" "Omegas do not practice medicine in Thornwall," Vielle said flatly. "Herbalism, domestic, that is what will be recorded. If you have a complaint, you may submit it in writing to the Margrave's office, where it will be reviewed in due course." Next, Leora opened her mouth to argue, but Dorson, who was standing directly behind her, placed a firm hand on her elbow and squeezed. The message was clear. Not here, not now. Leora swallowed her anger and stepped aside. The assignments came 3 days later. Most Omegas were sent to noble households as domestic attendants. Some were assigned to the kitchens, the laundries, the palace gardens. A handful, the youngest, the prettiest, were designated as companions to high-ranking alphas, a polite term that everyone understood and no one challenged. Leora was assigned to the palace itself, specifically to the lower kitchens, where her herbalism would be put to use flavoring soups and drying spices for the royal household. It was, in its way, a mercy. The palace was warm, the food was adequate, and the work was not difficult. But for Leora, being surrounded by ingredients she could have used to heal, dried yarrow, elderflower, willow bark, chamomile, and being told to use them only for cooking was a particular kind of torment. She did her work without complaint, kept her head down as Dorson had advised, and told herself that the concord lasted only through the winter. By spring, she would be sent home. She could endure anything for a few months. She first saw King Draven on her 9th day in the palace, and the sight of him nearly stopped her heart, though not for the reason most Omegas would have claimed. She was carrying a basket of dried rosemary through the east corridor when the doors at the far end burst open and the king strode through, flanked by Corwin and 2 other guards. He was mid-conversation, his deep voice echoing off the stone walls, and he moved with the coiled, predatory grace of an alpha in his prime. He was strikingly handsome. Even Leora, who had spent years cultivating immunity to the effect alphas had on Omegas, felt the pull of his presence like a tide. But what stopped her was not his beauty or his power. It was his color. She saw the gray undertone beneath his skin, the slight hollowing around his eyes, the way his left hand, the one not gesturing as he spoke, hung just slightly curled, as if the muscles were too tired to fully extend. She saw the almost imperceptible hitch in his stride, a fraction of a second where his right leg bore weight awkwardly before his body compensated. He was sick. She was sure of it with the same bone-deep certainty that had told her when the blacksmith's wound had turned septic, when old Marin's cough had shifted from nuisance to danger. Whatever was wrong with King Draven, it was not the autumn chill, and it was not getting better. It was getting worse. Over the following weeks, Leora watched the king whenever the opportunity presented itself, which, in a palace full of corridors and doorways and duties that carried her from one wing to another, was more often than she might have expected. She was not spying, she told herself. She was observing. There was a difference, even if the result looked the same. She noted that Draven ate less at each meal, that the cough had developed a wet edge, that his temper, always formidable, had grown shorter and more unpredictable. She heard servants whisper about a council meeting where the king had lost his train of thought entirely, staring at the table for a full 10 seconds before Soren Holt had smoothly redirected the conversation. She saw Lord Gadamer entering the king's chambers each evening with his leather bag of tonics and leaving each morning with the same placid smile and the same assurance that His Majesty was perfectly well. But His Majesty was not perfectly well, and Leora was beginning to suspect she knew why. The suspicion crystallized on a night when she was working late in the herb stores adjacent to the kitchens, cataloging a new shipment of dried botanicals. Among the standard supplies, bundles of thyme, sage, chamomile, fennel, she found something that did not belong. Tucked inside a crate of imported spices, wrapped in dark cloth, was a small leather pouch containing a fine ash-gray powder. She opened it carefully, held it to the lamplight, and sniffed. The smell was faint, almost sweet, with a bitter undertone that prickled the back of her throat. She recognized it immediately. Marin had shown it to her once years ago, keeping it locked in an iron box and handling it with gloves. Argentspane, sometimes called moonfall or the quiet death. It was a compound derived from the root of a rare mountain flower that grew only in the highest altitudes of the Thornwall Range, and it was one of the few substances in the natural world that was specifically lethally toxic to alpha-blooded shifters. In small, repeated doses, it mimicked the symptoms of a dozen common ailments: fatigue, cough, tremors, mental fog, loss of appetite. In larger doses or over extended periods, it attacked the bond between the alpha and their wolf, slowly severing the connection until the shifter could no longer transform, and then it killed them. Someone was poisoning the king. Leora's hands trembled as she rewrapped the pouch and placed it exactly as she had found it. Her mind raced through the implications. The powder was in the kitchen stores. It could be added to food, to drink, to the very herbs that Lord Gadamer was using in the king's nightly tonics. The symptoms matched perfectly: the fatigue, the cough, the gray pallor, the tremors, the mental lapses. If Draven had been receiving small doses of Argentspane for weeks or months, his wolf would already be weakening. If it continued, he would lose the ability to shift entirely, and shortly after that, he would die. And it would look like nothing more than a wasting illness that even the royal physician could not cure. The question was who, and the answer, when Leora allowed herself to think it through, was terrifying in its clarity. The Argentspane was in a shipment that passed through the Margrave's supply chain. The Concord of Service, which had conveniently flooded the palace with unfamiliar omegas, creating chaos and distraction, was Soren Holt's creation. Lord Gadamer, who should have recognized the symptoms, either could not or would not, and Gadamer had been appointed by the Margrave. Every thread led back to the same man, and that man was the most powerful advisor in the kingdom. Leora knew what she should do. She should go to Captain Corwin. She should go to the king himself. She should tell someone, anyone, what she had found. But she was an Omega assigned to the kitchens. An Omega with no standing, no name, no proof beyond a pouch of gray powder that could be explained away as a cooking spice by anyone with enough authority to do so. If she accused the Margrave and was wrong, she would be imprisoned or worse. If she accused the Margrave and was right, she might simply disappear. Soren Holt had not orchestrated a plot to murder the king without also planning for the possibility that someone might notice. So Leora did what she had always done. She healed. Working carefully, secretly, using only the legitimate kitchen supplies available to her, she began to prepare a counteragent. Argentspane was deadly, but it was not unstoppable. Not if you knew what you were doing, and not if the poisoning was still in its earlier stages. Marin had taught her the formula years ago, more as an academic exercise than a practical one, but Leora had a flawless memory for recipes and compounds. The counteragent required a base of gold thread root, steeped in milk thistle extract and combined with precise measures of turmeric, charcoal powder, and the distilled oil of black elderberry. Each ingredient was common enough in a palace kitchen. None would raise suspicion on its own. Together, administered in small, regular doses, they would bind to the Argentspane compounds in the king's blood and neutralize them before they could do further damage. The challenge was delivery. Leora could not exactly walk up to the king and hand him a cup of medicine. She could not add it to his food without access to the royal kitchens, which were separate from the lower kitchens where she worked. And she certainly could not explain what she was doing without revealing everything she knew, which would put her in as much danger as the king. Fate, or something like it, provided the answer. On a bitter evening in early winter, a commotion erupted in the East Wing. One of the palace hounds, an enormous gray wolf dog that served as the king's personal hunting companion, had been found convulsing in the kennels. The kennel master, in a panic, had sent for Lord Gadamer, who was attending a dinner engagement and could not be reached. Someone, Leora never learned who, suggested that the Omega from the kitchens, who was said to know something about herbs, might be able to help. Leora was escorted to the kennels by a skeptical guard and found the wolf dog, a beast named Stormclaw, lying on his side in the straw, his massive body rigid with seizure. The kennel master, a grizzled beta named Hatch, stood over him, wringing his hands and muttering that the king would have his head if this animal died. Leora knelt beside Stormclaw, examined his eyes, his gums, his pulse, and identified the problem within minutes. The dog had eaten something contaminated, likely scraps from the kitchen that contained traces of the same poison being used on the king. She worked quickly, mixing a purgative from the kennel's meager supply of herbs and administering it with steady hands, while Hatch and the guard watched in stunned silence. Within an hour, Stormclaw's seizures had stopped. By dawn, the dog was drinking water and weakly thumping his tail. Word traveled fast in a palace, and by the following afternoon, the story had reached the king himself. Draven, who loved Stormclaw with a fierce, uncomplicated devotion he showed to very few living things, demanded to see the Omega who had saved his dog. Leora was brought to the throne room, not the intimate study where Draven conducted most of his business, but the full formal throne room, with its vaulted ceiling and iron chandeliers, and the massive ironwood throne carved from a single ancient oak. The room was not empty. Corwin was there, along with several guards, 2 council members, and, standing to the king's right with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of mild curiosity, Margrave Soren Holt. Draven sat on the throne with one leg crossed over the other, his amber eyes fixed on Leora as she was led to the center of the room. She was acutely aware of everything: the echoing silence, the cold stone beneath her thin shoes, the way every alpha in the room watched her with that particular blend of interest and condescension that she had learned to recognize and endure. She stood before the king and did not kneel, because no one had told her to, and she was not going to volunteer. "You're the one who healed Stormclaw," Draven said. It was not a question. "I treated the symptoms of what appeared to be toxic ingestion," Leora replied, keeping her voice even. The dog responded well to a standard purgative compound. There was a flicker of something in Draven's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at being addressed so directly by an Omega. "Gadamer tells me you use techniques beyond standard herbalism. He seems to think you overstepped your station." "Lord Gadamer was unavailable," Leora said. "The animal was dying. I used the knowledge I had." "If that constitutes overstepping, then I accept the charge." A murmur rippled through the room. Corwin, Leora noticed, was fighting a smile. Soren Holt's expression had not changed, but his eyes had sharpened, the way a hawk's eyes sharpen when it spots movement in the grass. Draven studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the casual authority of a man who had never in his life doubted his own judgment. "You're brave, I'll grant you that. But bravery in an Omega is like armor on a songbird. Impressive to look at, useless in practice. You saved a dog. I'm grateful. But let's not pretend that makes you a physician. You're an Omega. Whatever skills you think you have, they are a fraction of what a trained alpha healer could do. You were lucky. The dog was lucky. Next time, wait for someone qualified." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Leora felt the impact in her chest, not because she had expected better from him, but because for one brief, foolish moment she had hoped for it. She had hoped that the king who funded Omega shelters and punished abusers might also be the king who recognized that Omegas were capable of more than he believed. But hope, as Marin used to say, was a herb that grew best in poor soil and rarely survived the harvest. "As you say, Your Majesty," Leora murmured, and for the first time since entering the room she lowered her eyes. She was dismissed and sent back to the kitchens. But something had changed. The encounter had placed her on the map of the palace's internal landscape, and maps once drawn are difficult to erase. Corwin began appearing near the kitchens with unlikely frequency, asking casual questions about herbs and remedies with the transparent interest of a man who was very concerned about someone's health and running out of people to trust. Leora answered his questions carefully, offering just enough to be helpful without revealing the depth of what she knew. She liked Corwin. He was honest in a way that was rare in the palace. blunt, direct, and clearly devoted to his king. Meanwhile, she continued her secret work. She found a way to introduce the counter-agent into the king's routine through the one channel she could access, the palace hound's food supply, which was prepared in the lower kitchens and which, she had learned, Draven frequently supplemented with scraps from his own plate. It was not ideal. The dose was imprecise, the delivery unreliable, but it was something, and within 2 weeks, she began to hear whispers that the king's cough had improved slightly, that his appetite had returned somewhat, that his color looked better. The Argentbane was still being administered. She checked the stores regularly and found the pouch repeatedly depleted and refilled. But the counter-agent was fighting it to a standstill. It was not enough. Leora knew it was not enough. The poisoner would eventually increase the dose, and her indirect countermeasures would fail. She needed to expose the truth, and to do that, she needed proof. Real, undeniable proof that would survive the political firestorm of accusing the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king himself. She began to keep records, dates, quantities, observations. She noted every time the Argentbane pouch was refilled and by whom the supply crates were delivered. She charted the king's visible symptoms against the probable dosing schedule and documented the improvement that coincided with her counteragent. She stored her notes in a hollowed-out brick behind the kitchen hearth, where no one would think to look. And she waited for the mistake she knew the poisoner would eventually make. The mistake came in the form of a dinner. The midwinter banquet was Thornwall's grandest social event, a celebration that filled the palace with nobles, dignitaries, and enough food and wine to feed a small army. It was also, Leora realized, the perfect opportunity for the poisoner to deliver a concentrated dose. The king would be eating and drinking publicly, served from communal platters prepared by an army of cooks in kitchens that would be too chaotic to monitor closely. If a fatal dose of Argentbane were administered during the banquet, it would simply look like the king's mysterious illness had finally claimed him, tragically, publicly, and beyond the reach of blame. Leora tried to warn Corwin. She found him in the barracks yard 2 days before the banquet and told him, with as much directness as she dared, that she believed the king was being poisoned and that the banquet presented a critical danger. Corwin listened with an expression that cycled through disbelief, alarm, and a grim recognition that suggested he had harbored similar fears. But when Leora named the substance, Argentbane, and described the symptoms it produced, Corwin's face went pale. "That's a death sentence accusation," he said quietly. "Against whom?" Leora hesitated. Naming Soren Holt to the king's captain of the guard, without ironclad evidence, was a gamble that could end in her execution. But the banquet was in 2 days, and she was out of time for caution. "The Margrave," she said. Corwin stared at her for a very long time. Then he closed his eyes, exhaled through his nose, and said something that Leora would never forget. "I know." He had suspected for months. He had watched Soren's behavior, tracked his movements, noticed the way the Margrave's influence had expanded in direct proportion to the king's decline. He had found irregularities in the palace supply records, shipments that didn't match orders, expenses that couldn't be accounted for. But Corwin was a soldier, not a physician. He knew something was wrong, but he lacked the medical knowledge to identify the poison or prove the connection. Leora had the missing piece. Together they had the beginnings of a case, but they did not have enough time to build one before the banquet. The night of the midwinter banquet, the great hall of Thornwall blazed with 1,000 candles. Nobles in their finest furs and velvets filled every seat, and the long tables groaned under platters of roasted venison, honeyed pheasant, spiced wine, and fresh bread. At the high table, King Draven presided in a doublet of black and crimson, his dark hair catching the candlelight, his amber eyes surveying the hall with an expression that managed to be both commanding and vaguely irritated, as though the celebration was an obligation he endured rather than enjoyed. To his right sat Soren Holt, impeccable in gray silk, his wineglass already half empty and his smile already fully deployed. Leora was not supposed to be in the great hall. Omega kitchen workers served the lower tables at best, and usually remained in the kitchens entirely. But she had convinced the head cook, a sympathetic beta woman named Greta who had grown fond of Leora's quiet competence, to assign her to wine service for the evening. She carried a pitcher of mulled wine through the hall, refilling glasses and watching the high table with every fiber of her attention. She saw the moment it happened. A servant, not one of the regular palace staff, but a young man she had never seen before approached the high table with a fresh carafe of wine. He poured for the Margrave first, then moved to the king. As he poured, his left hand, the one not holding the carafe, passed briefly over the rim of the king's goblet. The movement was smooth, practiced, almost invisible. Almost. But Leora had been watching for exactly this, and she saw the faint dusting of gray powder that fell from the servant's palm into the wine. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the consequences or weigh her options or consider what a rational person would do. She moved, crossing the hall in quick, purposeful strides. She reached the high table just as Draven lifted his goblet toward his lips. And in full view of the entire assembled nobility of Thornwall, Leora Voss, Omega, kitchen worker, nobody, slapped the goblet out of the king's hand. The silence that followed was absolute. Wine splashed across the white tablecloth in a spray of dark crimson. The goblet clattered to the floor and rolled to a stop against the leg of a chair. Every eye in the hall turned to the Omega standing before the king with her hand still raised and her chest heaving and an expression on her face that was not fear, not defiance, but something closer to desperate certainty. Draven rose from his chair with the slow, dangerous deliberation of a predator deciding whether to strike. His amber eyes blazed. The alpha authority radiating from him hit Leora like a physical force. She felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the ancient Omega instinct that screamed at her to submit, to apologize, to make herself small. She did not. "Give me one reason," Draven said, his voice so low and so controlled that it was more frightening than any shout. "Why I should not have you dragged from this hall in chains." "Because that wine was poisoned," Leora said, loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. "And if you had drunk it, you would have been dead before dawn." The uproar was instantaneous. Nobles leaped to their feet. Guards surged forward. Soren Halt's smile vanished so completely that for a single unguarded instant, the mask fell away entirely, and Leora saw what was underneath: cold, calculating fury. Then the mask slid back into place, and the Margrave was on his feet, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "Your Majesty, this Omega is clearly deranged. I recommend she be removed immediately before she causes further—" "Test it," Leora interrupted, her voice rising above the din. She pointed at the wine staining the tablecloth. "Test the wine. If I'm wrong, you can chain me, imprison me, execute me. I don't care. But test it first." Draven's eyes moved from Leora to the wine, to Soren, to Corwin, who had stepped forward from his position near the wall and was now standing directly behind Leora, with one hand on the hilt of his sword, and an expression that said very clearly that anyone who wanted to remove this Omega would have to go through him first. "Corwin?" Draven said, and the single word contained a dozen questions. "I think," Corwin said carefully, "that the wine should be tested, my king." The silence stretched. Draven looked at the stained tablecloth, at the goblet on the floor, at the Omega who stood before him with green eyes blazing and no trace of submission in her bearing. Then he looked at Soren Halt, and something shifted in the king's expression, something subtle and terrible, the first crack in a foundation that had been weakening for a very long time. "Fetch Gadamer," Draven ordered. "Test the wine, and no one leaves this hall." The next 2 hours were the longest of Leora's life. Lord Gadamer was dragged from his chambers in his nightrobe, protesting loudly, and set to work analyzing the wine with the limited alchemical equipment that could be assembled on short notice. While they waited, Draven sat motionless on his throne, his amber eyes fixed on nothing, his jaw set in a line that could have been carved from granite. Soren Halt remained at the high table, outwardly calm, sipping water from a glass he had poured himself, and making occasional comments to nearby nobles about the unfortunate spectacle of an unbalanced Omega disrupting the kingdom's most sacred celebration. Leora stood in the center of the hall, flanked by guards, and waited. She was terrified. She was certain. She was both of these things simultaneously, and she held on to the certainty the way a drowning person holds onto a piece of driftwood. When Gadamer finally turned from his makeshift workstation, his face was the color of old parchment. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The wine," he said, in a voice that shook, "contains Argentspane, a concentrated dose, enough to—" He stopped, swallowed. "Enough to be fatal to an alpha within hours." The hall erupted. Draven stood, and the force of his presence, the full unleashed weight of an alpha king in the grip of fury, silenced the room like a thunderclap. His eyes found Soren halt, and in that gaze there was no doubt, no hesitation, and no mercy. "Soren," Draven said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the hall. "Would you like to explain?" What happened next happened very fast. Soren Holt was many things: cunning, patient, meticulous. But he was not a fool, and he recognized the sound of a trap closing. In one fluid motion, he overturned the table, drew a blade that had been concealed beneath his robes, and lunged, not for the door, and not for freedom, but directly at Draven himself. If the king was going to die anyway, Soren clearly intended to finish the job personally. Draven shifted. It happened in the space between heartbeats. One moment there was a man in black and crimson, and the next there was a wolf the size of a draft horse, midnight black, amber-eyed, and snarling with a sound that shook the iron chandeliers. But the shift was wrong. Leora saw it immediately. The wolf was smaller than it should have been, its movements sluggish, its coordination fractured by months of poison eating away at the bond between man and beast. Draven lunged at Soren and missed. His right foreleg buckled, the same weakness Leora had noticed in his human stride, and he stumbled, crashing into the high table and sending platters and candelabras flying. Soren's blade found its mark. The dagger, coated, Leora would later learn, in a concentrated Argentspane solution, plunged into the wolf's left shoulder. Draven howled. The sound was not just pain but anguish, the cry of a creature feeling its own strength betray it. He crashed to the floor, and Soren stood over him, blade raised for a killing strike, and in his pale blue eyes, there was nothing. No regret, no hesitation, nothing but the cold arithmetic of power-changing hands. Leora moved without conscious thought. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron candelabra from the ruined high table, and swung it with every ounce of strength in her body. It connected with Soren's arm just above the wrist, and the crunch of breaking bone was audible throughout the silent hall. The blade clattered from his hand. He screamed, a raw animal sound that was the first genuine noise the Margrave had made all evening, and staggered backward, clutching his shattered forearm. Corwin was on him in an instant. Two guards pinned Soren to the floor while Corwin stood over him with his sword drawn and an expression of absolute, incandescent rage. Around the hall, Soren's planted loyalists. There were a handful, easily identified by the way they had been edging toward the exits, were seized by guards who had been quietly positioned by Corwin throughout the evening, because Corwin, for all that he was a soldier and not a politician, was not stupid. But Leora was not watching any of that. She was on her knees beside the fallen wolf, whose black fur was matting with blood around the wound in his shoulder, and whose amber eyes were glazing with pain and the creeping paralysis of the Argentspane coating. The counteragent. She needed the counteragent, and she needed it now. A concentrated dose, far stronger than the diluted version she had been smuggling through the dog food. "I need gold thread root, milk thistle, turmeric, charcoal, and black elderberry oil," she said, to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. "Now, from the palace stores. Someone get them now." It was perhaps a measure of how completely the night had shattered the normal order of things that no one questioned her. A servant ran. Gadamer, still pale but functioning, pointed the servant in the right direction. Within minutes, Leora had the ingredients spread on the stone floor beside the wounded king, and she was working with the focused, methodical intensity of someone who has trained for exactly this moment without ever knowing it would come. She ground the gold thread with the pommel of a dropped sword. She mixed the tincture in an overturned goblet. She tore strips from the hem of her own dress to clean the wound. The wolf whimpered. His great head turned toward her, and those amber eyes, clouded with pain but still, impossibly, aware, fixed on her face. And in that moment, something happened that Leora could not explain and would spend a long time trying to understand. The air between them changed. It thickened, warmed, became charged with a current that hummed just below the threshold of hearing. She felt something shift inside her chest, as though a lock she had never known existed had suddenly turned. The wolf's nostrils flared. His eyes widened, and through the pain and the poison and the chaos, a low, rumbling sound emerged from his throat. Not a growl, not a whimper, but something in between. Something ancient. The mate bond. Leora felt it settle into her bones like sunlight sinking into stone. Warm, inevitable. undeniable. The wolf felt it too. She could see it in the way his body relaxed fractionally beneath her hands, in the way his breathing steadied, in the way his eyes never left her face. The bond was not a choice. It was a recognition, the universe's quiet, implacable declaration that these two souls, against all logic and expectation, belonged to each other. "Stay with me," Leora whispered, pressing the tincture-soaked cloth to the wound. "Don't you dare die on me now, you stubborn, arrogant, beautiful fool." She worked through the night. The wolf shifted back to human form sometime before dawn, a wrenching, painful transformation that left Draven lying naked and shivering on the blood-stained floor of his own great hall, surrounded by the wreckage of the banquet and the evidence of his betrayal. Leora covered him with a cloak someone had brought, continued administering the counteragent, and refused to leave his side even when Gadamer, who was now looking at her with an expression that blended professional awe with deep personal shame, offered to take over. "With respect, Lord Gadamer," Leora said without looking up from her patient, "you have been treating him for months and you never once identified the poison. So no, I will not hand him over to you." Gadamer opened his mouth, closed it, and sat down heavily on a nearby chair. No one else tried to intervene. Draven woke at dawn. He opened his eyes slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth, and the first thing he saw was Leora's face, exhausted, tear-streaked, lit by the thin gray light of a winter morning filtering through the hall's high windows. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice rough with pain and disuse and something that might have been wonder, he said, "You." "Me?" Leora agreed. "You hit Soren Holt with a candelabra." "I did. You knocked the wine out of my hand in front of the entire court." "Also true." A pause. Draven's amber eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and simultaneously made it impossible to do so. "I called you weak," he said. "You called all Omegas weak," Leora corrected. "I just happened to be the one standing in front of you at the time." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. This one was not angry or dangerous or charged with political consequence. It was the silence of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew and finding the foundations wanting. "I was wrong," Draven said, and then, quieter, with a vulnerability that transformed his face from something carved and commanding into something achingly human. "I was wrong about a great many things." The days that followed the midwinter banquet were among the most turbulent in Thornwall's history. Soren Holt was imprisoned in the palace's deepest dungeon, his broken arm set with less care than Leora would have liked but more than he deserved. Interrogation revealed the full scope of his conspiracy. The poisoning had begun 6 months before the Concord, administered through contaminated spices in the royal kitchen supply chain. Gadamer had not been complicit, merely incompetent, too reliant on traditional diagnosis, and too respectful of the Margrave's authority to question the obvious. The Concord of Service itself had been designed as both a distraction and a mechanism for placing Soren's agents throughout the palace. The unfamiliar servant who had dosed the banquet wine was one of them, a hired assassin from outside the kingdom, who was found dead in his quarters the morning after the banquet, having taken his own poison rather than face interrogation. Soren's motive was the oldest one in the book: power. The Holt family had once been rivals to the Ashvanes for the throne, a rivalry that had ended 3 centuries ago in blood and humiliation. Soren had spent his entire adult life positioning himself to reclaim what he considered his birthright, and his plan had been elegant in its patience: weaken the king gradually, ensure no heir existed, and step into the vacuum with a coalition of nobles who either supported his claim or owed him enough favors to accept it. He confessed to all of this with the detached calm of a man who had simply lost a very long game of chess. He expressed no remorse. He expressed nothing at all, except a thin, contemptuous amusement when told that the Omega from the kitchens had been the one to unravel everything. "An Omega," he said, and laughed. It was the last sound anyone heard him make before the dungeon door closed. Draven's recovery was slow but steady. The Argentsbane had done significant damage to his bond with his wolf, and Leora warned him, with the blunt honesty that was rapidly becoming the defining feature of their relationship, that a full recovery would take months of treatment, and that he might never be quite as strong in his wolf form as he had been before. Draven accepted this with a nod and a wry comment about finally having a physician who told him the truth instead of what he wanted to hear. He submitted to Leora's treatment regimen without complaint, drank her foul-tasting tinctures without grimacing, much, and allowed her to examine him daily with a thoroughness that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances and was still raising eyebrows throughout the court. The mate bond complicated everything and simplified everything simultaneously. They both felt it, that constant low hum of connection, the way Draven's eyes found Leora in any room she entered, the way her pulse quickened when he was near, the way his nightmares eased when she sat beside his bed, and the way her anxiety quieted when his hand found hers. They did not discuss it for the first week, circling the subject with the cautious precision of two people who recognized that acknowledging the bond would change their lives irrevocably and were not entirely sure they were ready for it. It was Leora who broke the silence, because of course it was. She was sitting in the window seat of Draven's study, reviewing the notes she had compiled on his treatment, when he looked up from a stack of council reports and said, "You don't have to stay in the kitchens anymore. I've arranged for proper quarters in the East Wing." "Why?" Leora asked, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to hear him say it. Draven set down his quill. He looked at her across the firelit room, and in his amber eyes there was something she had never seen there before. Not the authority of a king or the dominance of an alpha, but a raw, unguarded openness that made him look younger, softer, and more uncertain than she had imagined possible. "Because you are my mate," he said. "Because from the moment my wolf recognized you on the floor of that hall, I have been trying to find the right words to tell you that everything I thought I understood about strength and weakness was wrong. Because you saved my life, Leora, not despite being an Omega, not in spite of it. You saved me because of who you are. And who you are is the bravest, most stubborn, most infuriatingly brilliant person I have ever known." Leora looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That's a good start." He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, the first she had ever heard from him, and the sound filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Accepting the mate bond was a decision they made together, slowly and deliberately, in the weeks that followed. There was no single dramatic moment, no grand declaration before the court, no ceremony or spectacle. There were quiet conversations by the fire in Draven's study. There were walks through the palace gardens in the pale winter sunlight, where Draven told Leora about his father and the war and the weight of a crown he had never wanted, and Leora told him about Marin and Brackenmore, and the years she had spent healing people who would not even call her a healer. There were arguments, fierce, passionate arguments about policy and law and the treatment of Omegas in Thornwall, arguments that ended with Draven pacing the room in frustrated silence and Leora sitting in her window seat with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And then, eventually, one of them would say something that made the other one laugh, and the tension would break like a fever. And there were the quieter moments, the ones that no one else saw. Draven's hand brushing Leora's as they passed in a corridor, Leora falling asleep in the study chair, and waking to find a blanket draped over her, and the fire freshly stoked. The night Draven's nightmares woke him gasping, and Leora, in the room next door, felt the spike of his terror through the bond and came to him without a word, sitting beside him in the dark until his breathing steadied, and his hand found hers and held it like an anchor. The formal announcement of the mate bond came in early spring, and the reaction was everything Leora had expected and nothing Draven had prepared for. The court was scandalized. An Omega, a kitchen worker, a commoner from a village no one could find on a map, as the king's mate, as the future queen of Thornwall. The noble families erupted. Lord Torvald of the Western March called it an abomination. Lady Yvain of the Southern Reach withdrew from court entirely, declaring that she would not bow to an Omega. A faction of conservative alphas began circulating a petition demanding that the king dissolve the bond, a legal impossibility, but a potent political symbol nonetheless. Draven met the opposition with the same iron resolve he brought to everything. He ignored it. He installed Leora in the queen's chambers, assigned her a personal guard, and informed the court that any insult directed at his mate would be treated as an insult to the crown. The message was clear, and most of the nobility, however reluctantly, fell into line. But Leora did not want to be protected. She wanted to be heard, and she approached the challenge of winning over a hostile court the same way she approached any problem, with patience, knowledge, and a refusal to be underestimated. She began with the thing she knew best. Thornwall's public health infrastructure was, she discovered, appallingly inadequate. The The kingdom had fewer than 40 trained physicians for a population of over 1 million, and most of those physicians served the nobility exclusively. Common people, alphas, betas, and omegas alike, relied on folk remedies, traveling charlatans, and hope. Infant mortality was staggering. Treatable diseases killed thousands every year. And the rigid caste system meant that omegas, who made up a significant portion of the population and who often possessed the patience, empathy, and fine motor skills that healing required, were barred from contributing. Leora presented her findings to the King's Council, uninvited and unannounced, on a Tuesday morning in mid-spring. She walked into the council chamber with a stack of documents, a map marked with the locations of every physician and healer in the kingdom, and the serene composure of a woman who had already been called weak by a king and lived to tell about it. The council members, all alphas, all men, all visibly uncomfortable, watched as she laid out the data with the methodical precision of a field surgeon laying out instruments. "Your kingdom is dying," she told them. "Not from war, not from famine, but from a failure of imagination. You have convinced yourselves that only alphas can heal, only alphas can lead, only alphas can contribute to the strength of Thornwall. And while you were busy being convinced, your people were burying their children." Draven, sitting at the head of the table, watched his mate address his council with an expression that blended pride, amusement, and something suspiciously close to awe. The Omega Rights Charter, as it came to be known, was not passed in a day. It was fought for over months of debate, revision, compromise, and occasional shouting. Leora drafted it. Corwin championed it within the military. Draven threw the weight of the crown behind it, which was considerable but not unlimited. The king could propose, but the council had to approve, and the council was slow, resistant, and deeply uncomfortable with the idea that the social order they had maintained for 3 centuries might be fundamentally wrong. The charter, in its final form, did not overthrow the existing system. Leora was pragmatic enough to know that revolutions built on paper crumbled if they did not first build foundations. Instead, the charter established 3 key reforms. First, omegas would be permitted to train in and practice medicine, alongside alphas and betas, in newly established healing schools funded by the crown. Second, omegas would be granted the right to own property and operate businesses, subject to the same regulations as any other citizen. Third, and most controversially, the Concord of Service was dissolved and replaced with a voluntary apprenticeship program that matched omegas with mentors in any field they wished to pursue, without compulsion or assignment. It was not equality, not yet, but it was a beginning. The first crack in a wall that had stood for 300 years. And cracks, as Leora knew from her study of both architecture and anatomy, had a way of spreading. The signing of the charter took place in the Great Hall on the first warm day of summer, in the same room where Leora had knocked a goblet from the king's hand and changed the course of history. The room was full. Nobles, commoners, omegas, who had traveled from every province to witness the moment. Draven signed first, his strong hand steady, his amber eyes meeting Leora's across the table, with a look that contained more than any words could have conveyed. Then Leora signed, as co-author and as witness, and the hall erupted in a sound that was part cheer, part sob, and entirely new. That evening, after the celebrations had quieted and the hall had emptied and the candles had burned down to pools of wax, Draven found Leora on the palace ramparts, looking out over the city of Ashenmere as the last light of the longest day faded from the sky. He came up beside her in silence, and for a long moment they simply stood together, watching the lights of the city flicker to life below them like earthbound stars. "You know," Draven said, "when they brought you to the throne room that first time, the day you saved Stormclaw, I almost felt it then. The bond. Something stirred, something I didn't understand. I think that's why I was so harsh. I think I was afraid of what it meant." Leora looked at him. The fading light softened the hard planes of his face, and in his amber eyes she saw not a king, not an alpha, not the most powerful man in Thornwall, but simply a man, complicated, imperfect, trying to be better than the world had taught him to be. She reached for his hand. "You called me weak," she said. "I was an idiot." "You were," she agreed. "But you were an idiot who listened, eventually. That's more than most." Draven turned to face her fully. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender and so at odds with the fierce warrior. The world knew that Leora felt the mate bond pulse warm and bright in her chest, a golden thread connecting her heartbeat to his. "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not," Leora said, "but here we are." He smiled, that rare, real smile that transformed his entire face, and pulled her close. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Below them, the city hummed with life. Beyond the walls, the forests stretched toward the mountains, dark and ancient and full of wolves. And somewhere in the distance, Leora thought she heard a howl, long, clear, and triumphant, rising toward a sky full of emerging stars. It was, she decided, a good beginning. The months that followed the charter's signing tested its promises against reality, and reality, as always, pushed back. The first Omega healing schools opened in Ashenmere, Brackenmore, and 3 other provincial capitals, funded by Crown Treasury, and staffed by a combination of existing physicians who had volunteered, or been firmly encouraged, to teach alongside Omega healers, whom Leora had personally vetted. Enrollment was strong. Resistance was stronger. In the Western March, Lord Torvald refused to allow the school to open on his lands, citing ancient territorial rights. In the Southern Reach, Lady Yvain funded a rival institution that taught Omegas exclusively domestic skills and publicly declared it the proper alternative to what she called the Queen's Experiment. In 3 separate provinces, Omega students were harassed, threatened, or assaulted by alphas who viewed the charter as a personal insult. Draven responded to each incident with the decisive force that had made him a feared military commander and was now making him an increasingly effective domestic ruler. He stripped Torvald of his territorial exemptions and stationed a garrison in the Western March with orders to ensure the school's opening. He invited Lady Yvain to court for what was described as a diplomatic conversation and was rumored to have been a very one-sided lecture that left Yvain pale and silent for a week. He ordered Corwin to establish a dedicated protection detail for Omega students in every province, and he personally visited 2 of the schools that had been targeted, standing in the courtyard in full alpha authority and asking, with deceptive mildness, whether anyone present had objections to the education occurring inside. No one did, at least not to his face. Leora, meanwhile, was fighting a quieter battle, one that could not be won with garrisons or royal decrees. The Omegas themselves needed to believe that the charter was real, that the opportunities it offered were genuine and not a trap. Generations of restriction had bred a deep, bone-level caution in the Omega population, a survival instinct that said, "Do not reach for what you are told you cannot have, because the reaching itself will be punished." Leora understood this instinct. She had spent her own life navigating it, pushing against it, finding ways to be what she was, without triggering the systems designed to keep her small. And she knew that no law, however well-intentioned, could dissolve centuries of internalized submission overnight. So she told her story. She traveled to provinces across the kingdom, standing before gatherings of Omegas in village halls and market squares and temple courtyards, and she told them about Brackenmore, about Marin, about the blacksmith's thigh wound and the skills she had been told she could not possess. She told them about the palace kitchens and the Argent's bane and the night she had knocked a goblet from a king's hand. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She told the truth, plainly and completely, and she let the truth do its work. "I was not brave," she told a gathering of young Omega women in the eastern port city of Darrow's Gate. "I was terrified. I was angry. I was desperately, unreasonably certain that I was right, and equally certain that no one would listen. But I did it anyway. Not because I am special. Not because I am different from any of you. I did it because someone was dying, and I knew how to help. And the only thing standing between me and the act of helping was a rule written by people who had never met me and did not know what I could do. And I decided, in that moment, without thinking, without planning, that the rule was wrong. That is all. The rule was wrong, and I refused to follow it. Any of you could make that same decision. Any of you could refuse. And if enough of us refuse, the rules will change. Not because anyone gives us permission, but because we stop asking for it." The room was silent when she finished. Then a woman in the back, an Omega, who looked to be about 70, with silver hair and hands gnarled by decades of labor, began to clap. Others joined. The sound swelled until it filled the hall and spilled out into the street, and Leora stood at the center of it with tears on her cheeks, and a fierce, unshakable hope burning in her chest. By autumn of the following year, Enrollment in the Omega Healing Schools had tripled. The first class of Omega graduates received their certifications in a ceremony that Draven himself attended, placing the seal on each diploma with his own hand. 3 Omegas had been appointed to provincial advisory councils. 2 had opened their own apothecaries. 1, a young woman named Pella, the same shy girl who had wept in the carriage on the way to Ashenmere, had become the first Omega to serve as a field medic in Thornwall's border patrol, where she was credited with saving the lives of 2 Alpha soldiers after a skirmish with bandits. When Draven heard this last piece of news, he was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Leora, who was sitting across from him at the breakfast table reading a report on school funding, and said, "You were right." Leora looked up. "About which thing?" "I've been right about so many." He smiled. "About all of it. About Omegas. About strength. About what this kingdom could be if it stopped clinging to what it was." He paused. "And about me. I was the kind of Alpha I warned others not to be. Not cruel, but blind. You opened my eyes." Leora reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that still, after all these months, surprised her from a man whose hands could become claws, whose body could become a weapon. "You opened your own eyes," she said. "I just gave you a reason to look." In the great hall of Thornwall, where candles once again blazed in the iron chandeliers, and the ironwood throne stood solid as the centuries that had shaped it, the kingdom moved forward. Imperfectly, incompletely, with resistance and setbacks, and the slow, grinding work of changing a world one mind at a time. But it moved, and at its center, bound by a bond that neither law nor poison nor prejudice had been able to break, stood a king who had learned that true strength was not dominance but recognition, and an Omega who had always known that weakness was not a condition of birth but a story told by those who feared what others might become if they were allowed to try. And in the forests beyond the walls, on clear nights when the moon hung full and silver over the mountains, the wolves of Thornwall raised their voices to the sky, and among them, the loudest and the proudest, a great black wolf with amber eyes ran beside a golden-haired woman who had never been afraid to run at his side, not behind him, not beneath his protection, at his side, where she had always belonged. The howl that rose between them was not a sound of dominance or submission. It was a sound of recognition, of balance, of 2 voices finding a harmony that neither could have achieved alone. It echoed through the valleys and over the mountains and into the night, and those who heard it, Alpha, Beta, Omega alike, paused in whatever they were doing and listened, because some sounds once heard change the way you understand the world. This was one of them.